So that was my attempt to explain it via Maturana and Varela. And then now I'm going to kind of move on to the way that the more physicsy way of thinking about it that I'm more comfortable with, because it's more based on things I can see and observe directly. So the question is this a problem? If you like autopoiesis. Because a hurricane is a very, very interesting thing. Biologists tend not to think they're very interesting, but people that study hurricanes tend to think they are. And they tend to think they tend to agree with me that they're a lot like an organism, because a hurricane is something that it persists dynamically. What a hurricane does is when you've got a warm surface, when the sea surface is very warm, the upper atmosphere is very cold, you can extract energy by transferring heat from the warm area to the cold area. And basically the hurricane is a very complicated machine that extracts that energy, turns it into kinetic energy, and then uses that kinetic energy to construct this actually fairly complicated structure, which itself is very nicely spatially localized. So for me, reading this definition of autopoiesis, it seems to describe this perfectly. And I think that's great. I think it's lovely. Unfortunately, Maturana and Varela, when they were confronted with these types of examples, because they wanted autopoiesis to be a definition of life, they kind of stepped back from this kind of thing. They changed their definition. They really focused hard on the cell membrane as being something that a cell has that this doesn't have. But I think that was a mistake. I think it's much more interesting to think about what these things have in common with life and cognition than what makes them different. Yeah?
So here's why some people like the evolutionary history of life, because even though you're alive, but you don't have your evolutionary history in front of you, the fact that you had that evolutionary history makes you something very distinguishable from that hurricane, because evolution makes things more complicated. So that complexity might, plus the other part is just make it to something that is more easily identifiable as life rather than.
Yeah, it's a great comment, and if you feel at the end that I haven't addressed it, let's discuss it some more. I hope I'll get to that a bit. So, okay, so things like typhoons are called dissipative structures. This was termed by a guy called Precariousness. Unfortunately, the term in some ways has become unpopular because people tended to leap on it and say, aha, life is a dissipative structure, now we have explained everything and we can stop. But I think it's more interesting to keep going, to keep probing this. So dissipative structures, they all have this property of being maintained by a dynamical balance of processes. They all have to consume energy from somewhere. They all have this ship of Theseus property. They're made of things that keep changing all the time. So the typhoon, the air blows through it, but the typhoon stays, just like the atoms move through me, but I stay. So we can look at some other examples. We're kind of taking a more kind of empirical approach to understanding this than a definition-based approach. So sand dunes are a great example. They feed on the difference in velocity between the air and the sand. Fire, of course, is a lovely example because it really is a set of chemical reactions that really do regenerate each other, and there's a lot of research on combustion in kind of that you can draw on to understand that. There are chemical reactions that you can do in a Petri dish that form patterns. And of course, the same is true of cells and human beings. There are structures in the world that are not dissipative. So these droplets are just droplets. They stay that way because of surface tension. The Sphinx, well, actually people do repair it, so it's a little bit dissipative, but in this kind of state, it stays the way it is because it's made of rock and it falls apart only very slowly. And there are crystals and oil phase separations and things like that as well. So roughly speaking, structures in the world can be divided into ones that are dissipative and ones that are not. The boundary line is somewhat blurred, it's not something that seems to admit a particularly precise definition, I don't think, but maybe I'm wrong. So another key concept from the enactive literature is precariousness. So this is my definition. It's not the one that other people use. But the key point about precariousness is that a living system can die. If you disrupt those processes enough, the other ones won't be able to counter them anymore, and it'll just stop. It'll run down. And the point about this within enactivism is that the possibility of precariousness implies that things can be good or bad for the organism. So people, particularly Ezekiel de Paulo, want to say that precariousness is it almost is the origin of agency, because it's the origin of norms, it's the origin of things having some kind of relevance to you. My definition, which is possibly counterintuitive at first, is that something is precarious when the conditions for its formation are different from the conditions required to sustain it. So, for example, in order to form a typhoon, you need to have very low wind shear, you need to have quite specific circumstances. The water surface needs to be very hot. Once those happen, it can kind of spin up and you end up forming the typhoon. But then it can move around and it can go to places where those conditions are not the case, and it can still continue to extract energy from the sea surface until it goes over land or much colder water when it can't do that anymore, and then it dissipates. So this kind of precariousness property is actually really common. Fire, of course, is precarious because you can blow it out. Sorry, Nick.
For the conditions of formation, conditions of maintenance, do you think that they need to actually, one is always going to be a subset of the other? Or could you have a situation where, for instance, the conditions for maintenance are more severe than the conditions for formation, and still have that be an interesting case? I'm trying to think of things where they flash in and out of existence, but to actually sustain them is hard.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Okay. I can't think of an example off the top of my head. Though I suppose I wouldn't survive terribly well in a womb.
Yeah, okay.
So for organisms are very, very precarious, because in order to form an organism, a modern-day organism on the Earth in this epoch, in order to form an organism, you need an existing organism. There isn't really any way to, or Craig Venter's lab, I suppose. But apart from that, there's no other way to really do it. And yet they can survive in this huge range of environments.
Nathaniel, can I ask a quick question about death?
Yes.
The question is about which aspect of it is more central or more fundamental. You're emphasizing precariousness here.
Yeah.
In the earlier slides, you treated the set of dissipative structures, as you use the term, as a kind of natural category to be contrasted with the equilibrium type structures.
Yes.
Do you think that death is equally, or would you consider that that's equally a part of the maintenance process inherent to dissipative structures, as opposed to merely an expression of precariousness in the sense that the condition of maintenance can be different from the condition for emergence? And if that's too far from the track you're trying to develop, we can put it off or drop it. But I was curious how you would think about that.
I'm sorry, I don't think I understood the question fully. Can you?
Let me let you go on and we'll come back to it then.
Okay, okay. But I'm not sure even whether it's really possible to have a dissipative structure that isn't precarious, if that's what you mean. But it might be possible. I'm not really sure. Anyway. This is the point. I kind of already made it. The conditions can be much more specific, or just a bit more specific. And for organisms, they're really specific. You need to have another organism. And in the case of a human, it's not just another cell. It's the womb and the human society that brings you up and so on. So there are two kind of properties that dissipative structures can have that make them feel lifelike or autopoiesis-like to me. The other one is individuation, or what I call individuation. And that means the formation of distinct, similar, spatially separated individuals. So in the sense I mean it doesn't mean something that applies to one individual. It means a system that forms into many. The reason that this is important, well, there are many. But one is that distinct individuals have distinct life histories and also distinct evolutionary histories. In life, it's very, very common. In animals, it's very strong. It's very rare to find animals where it's not clear whether it's one or two. In plants, much less so, because you can find plants that are connected together by roots under the soil, and it doesn't particularly hurt them if you cut that root. At the cellular level, there are exceptions as well, such as slime molds. And individuation is something in the biological world that occurs on many levels. So you have individual ants, but you also have individuated ant colonies. So this gets onto that I should have had a photo of the book Major Transitions in Evolution by Maynard Smith and Seth Murray, which is where the multiple levels of individuals kind of comes from. But it's not an all or nothing thing, again. So for example, here are 3 photographs of sand dunes. These are on Earth, and these 2 are both on Mars. You get dunes of this form on Earth as well, but there are good photos from Mars because NASA has a great collection of photos. And the point is that for these ones, so this is a kind of bare rock surface with a very small amount of sand. The wind's blowing in this direction, and what happens is the sand collects together into these very distinctly individuated dunes. There's one here and there's one here, and there's no confusion about whether they're the same one. But in other places on Mars, here they look pretty separate, but here it's kind of hard to define where one ends and the next begins. And in this picture on Earth, it kind of doesn't make any sense to even ask that question, I think. So individuation for me doesn't imply this kind of hard membrane-bound separation between an individual and its environment. And that's really important because in the case of a living cell, things move across that boundary all the time. So it just doesn't make sense to define that boundary as the edge of the organism, even though it's quite sharp. So this extended autopoiesis that I presented is kind of, I think, the right way to think about these kinds of dissipative structures. Like, it doesn't make sense to say this is outside the dune and this is inside it. It makes much more sense to say it's an extended network because the turbulent airflow here is also part of it. So there are structures, dissipative structures that are individuated. There are ones that are precarious. So fire isn't particularly individuated, for example. And organisms are somewhere in this overlapping region. And this overlapping region all has analogues of metabolism in the sense that the enactive tradition uses that term. Anatomy. So, yes, Giovanna.
Sorry, I missed something.
Yes.
What were you saying about individuation? So you're saying that you cannot individuate? What's your criteria for individuating? Or do you don't want to individuate? Sorry.
I'm saying that, so I'm shying away from giving definitions because I want to base it on observation. And I'm saying that the various processes of moving and deposition of sand grains and airflow patterns in some cases produce sand dunes that divide into very clearly identifiable individuals that are separate from each other. And then
that's clearly identifiable from just looking at it. That's from our perspective.
Yeah, from I guess from an observer's perspective. And I don't want to get too deep into how you make these distinctions formally because I A, don't know how, and B, I'm not sure if it's really helpful to do so. But it's just, I guess I just mean by looking. This is really obviously different from this one, but they're also really obviously the same type of thing. And they have differences between them. This one has this little thing that this one doesn't have.
And they're clearly coupled since they're all showing up in a line rather than just scattered around randomly.
Yeah, and there's another great photo, I should have put it in, where you see these in a kind of flying V formation, like geese. It's really awesome. Anyway.
Sorry, because I really want to understand this point here. So you want to say that those are individual. Well, you don't want to give a definition of individuation, but you think those are clearly individuated. They look different from us, separate from us. But then you also wanted to say that anyway they are related to the environment via this process of reciprocal causation, and therefore they can extend.
I didn't quite get to any therefore yet, I guess. But the individuation, I'm using it to refer to the ongoing physical process that causes them to be divided into these distinct individuals. So the point about extendedness is that the network of processes that ends up forming this dune, it includes the fact that the air becomes turbulent when it goes like this. The dune kind of goes up like that and then sharply down, and the air has this turbulent recirculating flow here. And if that didn't happen, the dune wouldn't form and it wouldn't be a dune. So it includes things that are in the air. So it's sort of hard to say that you can be inside or outside of it.
And the cells in the multicellular organism is outside the individual cell, individuated cell.
Say again?
Cells in the multicellular organism, are they individuated or not?
Well, I mean, I suppose the cells are individuated, and also the organism, the multicellular organism, is also individuated on both. Yeah. I think is what I'd say.
I have a basic question about individuation. So how to define? Yeah. So if we see the humans, so this people is different from these people. We can see the face. As well. So example is the animal case. So we see the animal, so we can distinguish. So which is. So is it related to the individuation? So or this is just an impression of the.
You mean?
So yeah, so this.
In other words, is an individuation in your perception or?
Yeah.
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think I sort of want to say that it's in the world, but I'm not gonna argue against you if you say it's in my perception. Sorry not to have a good answer to that question. I think it's a good question. So. Yeah, my point is that just by observing these things in the physical world, you notice that some of them fall into this category that are both precarious and individuated to greater or lesser degrees, and that these these all have analogues of these things that are associated with autopoiesis in the in the literature on that subject. Right, so I kind of want to say that these are the things we should be looking at as being agent-like and studying as being agent-like. And then you can continue to refine this Venn diagram further. Some things produce membranes, doesn't necessarily make them individuated, but it might. Other things, of course, have genes and so on. You could put all sorts of other things in there, and you can identify life as being somewhere nested within this thing. Okay. So I'm aware that I'm getting close to the end. So the point here is just that we can readily observe and create systems that have this property, that have these properties that have been written about as being the kind of key fundamental properties of biology as it relates to cognition. And I want to get, I do in 5 minutes if I can, want to get onto some specific simulations because I think they're quite instructive. So this is a simulation of chemical reactions occurring on a surface. I didn't invent it. The idea here is that you've got this green stuff. Do I have the reactions? Yeah. This green stuff eats the blue stuff and produces more of itself, just on the molecular level. It's like fire. The blue stuff is constantly being fed in everywhere, so it doesn't get used up, and that's why these haven't just used up all the blue and died. And then it happens that if you set this simulation up, this gives rise to a set of partial differential equations, and if you set it up right, you get these things that are kind of chemically self-producing and also quite separated from one another. And depending on the patterns, depending on the parameters, you can get different patterns. This one wasn't supposed to disappear, but I guess it demonstrates precariousness. So sometimes you get these quite nicely individuated blobs. They look like they have membranes, but that's just the graphics, so don't pay attention to that. But sometimes you get things that are not particularly individuated. And the reason that happens is because this stuff is using up the food, and so you kind of end up with a dip in the food concentration and a hump in this thing. So have I got the arrows on here? Yeah. So this thing's producing more of itself, then it's kind of diffusing out that way, I'm not going to go through in detail this network of processes, but there's a network of processes that gives rise to the formation of a spot. Okay. Here's an interesting thing. These things respond interestingly to perturbations in their environment.